Hello Penguinauts, I'm the Beardy Penguin and welcome back to Kerbal Rising, looking at a slightly updated system map. A lot of our astronomers realised that most of the planets they were looking at, especially around Olum and in the outer solar system, happened to just be specks on their telescopes. We definitely didn't just reduce the size of the system because there were far too many planets that all look kind of the same in Gameslinx's Planet Overhaul. Right, moving on. So, last episode, we finally subdued Gaia and its populace, and we began expanding out into the inner solar system, subduing the pirates on Scorch and building a military garrison there. And this episode, we're going to turn around and head out into the outer solar system. So, we're sending the Crimson Fleet to Sonis. Now, the Crimson Fleet, it's a little bit ragtag at the moment. It consists of 2 Mars-class frigates, a Pluto-class corvette and an Eros-class corvette, plus, of course, the ISS Trojan and the ISS Spirit of Drados are 2 Neptune-class carriers. But it's sort of taken a back foot over the past few turns because we've spent all of our points, A, on the Anubis, that ridiculously expensive stealth ship that's currently trawling the inner solar system, and of course all the colony ships we've been using to develop the planets that we've been conquering. So we are kind of in desperate need of a refit and resupply and some much more powerful ships, because the biggest guns we currently have are 55mm railguns, and as we're going to find out this episode, those can't quite cut it all the time. But once we get to the Sonis system, of course using our curved steam drive to slow down after about a week's worth of constant thrust at about a third G, we then deploy the fleet. We can see the Pluto class there. We've also, of course, fully stocked everything now, so unlike with our battle with the Krios pirates over Scorch, we do actually have 6 torpedoes, all of the torpedoes in the Eros class and the Pluto. Now, Sonis is a Kerbin-like world, for reasons I will explain later. And that means that the forces here are very, very well supplied, and they have some pretty scary warships. And that means we're not going to be able to go toe-to-toe with this fleet at all. They've got 155mm railguns mounted on a destroyer, a frigate, and they've also got 2 escorting corvettes. So, what we're going to try and do is launch all 6 of our torpedoes at once, because they also have a pretty sophisticated point defense network on their destroyer and their frigate. So, if we send this many torpedoes all at once, we should be able to get at least half of them through. In practice, 1 point defense laser can reliably stop a single 0.625 meter torpedo. However, they have some longer range weapons as well, and they begin firing, first of all, the 155mm railgun, and second, the corvettes open up with their 30mm, and they begin to tear into our torpedoes. After we've begun making our course adjustments with RCS, we swap through each one, and we realise our second torpedo's already had its warhead blown clean off. So we're down to 5 torpedoes and we're nowhere near actually hitting these targets yet. So fingers crossed. Thankfully though, as I said, 1 point defense laser usually reliably stops a single 0.625 meter torpedo. However, they only have 2 point defense lasers on the destroyer, and the one on the frigate is on top of the frigate, so it's got some pretty glaring blind spots. So even though they're getting some pretty good shots on our torpedoes with their lasers, they're not actually going to be able to stop all of them. Now, the lasers only do damage when they get extremely close, and they aren't quite able to stop 2 of them before they slam straight into the destroyer and blow it to smithereens. Now, that was a very terrifying enemy we don't have to face, and thankfully, with the blind spot on the frigate, it's only able to get shots on 1 of our torpedoes, and the second one flies in and destroys it. So we managed to get 3 of our 6 torpedoes through their point defense network and pretty much rip the backbone out of their fleet. But we are certainly not out of the woods yet. These escorting corvettes have got 300mm of armour, and although they only have 30mm chain guns, so of course we have the range advantage with our 55mm railguns, that's a lot of armour, and 55mm is really not a big enough calibre of railgun to reliably get through that much armour. So even when we close to weapons range and we begin opening up and they have no hope of evading or returning fire, we're not actually doing much damage to them. Even though have actually buffed the accuracy of the 55mm railguns because it was just kind of ridiculous before, we're getting hits, but they're just bouncing off the armor and doing barely any damage whatsoever. This really shows we seriously need to invest in the Crimson Fleet in order to continue. I think after this turn we're going to halt our continuing spread out into the solar system just so we can actually build up the fleet a bit and get some slightly more powerful weaponry. I was actually about to disengage when suddenly one of the turrets on the Corvette gets blasted clean off by a 55mm round, and I remember, of course, the weapons don't have any armor on them. So we managed to get a few very lucky shots in and rip both 30mm cannons straight off of the Corvette, completely disabling it. So this means we do actually have a chance, but we're going to have to close to a much closer range and maneuver ourselves above the Corvettes so that we can get a clear shot on those turrets. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to hit them, and the armor is just going to sit here soaking up damage all day. Unfortunately, our Pluto class immediately bites the dust the moment we enter guns range. As you see, just 150mm of armor is like tinfoil compared to most weaponry. And that giant spherical fuel tank has always been a weak point. So we're certainly going to have to redesign our Corvettes for the future. But just as it begins to open up on our Mars class frigates, we managed to blast off the second turret, and the fleet is now completely disabled. We did kind of luck out there though. As I said, even though we won, we lost a Corvette, and it kind of pointed out some glaring deficiencies in the fleet. I've sort of been building the Crimson Fleet sort of, as I said, it's a bit ragtag. I've built it with the points I've had to hand for whatever purpose I've currently needed it to. There's been no real strategy to the design of the fleet and the layout. So I'm going to have a pretty radical overhaul of it and design a lot of new ships over the next few turns. We should have a pretty terrifying fleet, but it's going to take, as I said, a few turns in order to actually put it all together. Tape and I have also introduced a bit of a refit mechanic, so we can actually add some point defense lasers to our Mars classes, and, you know, we can modernize them a little bit. Anyway, in the meantime, we are heading down to the moon of Sonis, which is called Sojos, which has a pretty interesting looking feature volcano. It also, of course, has some tanks defending it, which we'll need to take out before we can head down to the main planet itself. So we're deploying our Mercury class dropship from the ISS Spirit of Drados, and we are, of course, going to deploy 2 of our new Ison class tanks. They are updated now because, of course, the 75mm chain guns are now a realistic size, and the 90mm and 105mm guns are all their correct sizes as well. So we've now got double-barreled 105mm guns on our Ison class tanks, which of course fire way less often than the old 75mm chain guns, but they're actually much smaller since they only have 2 barrels, not something like 8 barrels like the 75s did, and also they're much more powerful. And I think that's what we're going to need because we have some pretty scary looking tanks sitting on this moon. Now the gravity of the moon, I really should put a VTOL engine on the Mercury class. Again, I have to sort of land vertically. It's a little awkward. I'm not looking forward to having to invade Tylo. If we ever have to land on Tylo, I think this plane would really struggle. We have to design a specialized craft for it. But as you can see, our new Ison class, I think they look pretty nice with the rescaled 105mm guns. And we're going to send them flying towards the enemy emplacement. We get some nice air in the 0.3 Gs, but the gravity, as I said, 0.3 Gs, that's strong enough to mean that we're not, well, first of all, the recoil on the guns isn't going to flip us up, but just about weak enough that we still need RCS to try and correct for the insane recoil on these guns, and just try and stick ourselves to the ground. But it's a pretty nice gravity actually for tank battles. But we do start to get lit up from one of the 30mm emplacements, so we return fire, but at this kind of distance we're not going to be able to get down any kind of effective fire. So we're going to have to close the range a little bit, and with the crazy terrain we get ourselves a little bit of a respite from the enemy fire, and we continue closing. I do actually try and recreate a scene from Armageddon here. I found a giant canyon and I thought, oh yes, do that, recreate that scene in Armageddon, that really terribly scientifically inaccurate film, but also really fun film, where, you know, they fly across the canyon using the RCS on the armadillo, but the gravity's way too high. This is like a a 10-ton tank. So RCS jets in 0.3 Gs are not going to be enough to make you fly, so I was a little bit disappointed. But as we get to the top of the hill, we get some pretty sick air anyway, so you know, we sort of sated my desire to recreate cool scenes from movies. Anyway, so as we get within range, we are now in full view of the enemy tanks. Two of them have got those 75mm chain guns, recently resized, and one of them has of course got that 30mm that opened up on us. So we begin opening fire. Now these 75mm, since the chain guns have been rebalanced, they're actually quite inaccurate, but the rate of fire is still very, very high. And they fire explosive rounds, which are going to cleave straight through our relatively thin armour on these tanks, so we can't keep ourselves exposed for long. Thankfully though, they don't have particularly heavy armour either. I think they're all packing 150mm, and these 105mm guns can cut through those like a knife through butter. And so the first tank promptly explodes with this 30mm gun, and now we're just down to the 75mm, firing our weapons, trying to take them down, and sure enough, we take out the second one. We have a look at them actually. They're looking pretty funky, like they're giant creepy spiders. Sort of remind me of the tripods from War of the Worlds, except of course they have far more legs than that. But that also does make them a pretty massive target. They're not going to get any defense from the terrain when they've got their cockpit and their main weapon sitting up about 10 meters above the ground, but that does mean that they can get pretty much continuous fire on us, so there's no hiding either way. But since the cockpit is such an easy target, and same with the main weapon, we fire one round and we cut the 75mm chain gun clean off before this second one can actually get a clear shot at our leading tank. But unfortunately, it did manage to get a shot away at our second tank. I didn't actually catch it, but I just swapped to it to see it crashing back down towards the ground and promptly exploding. Those explosive rounds, one must have just hit the ground right underneath the tank, and in the low gravity sent it spiraling up into the sky. And the gravity was just high enough, unfortunately, that the RCS jets couldn't stop it. So I got a little annoyed at that, since we'd pretty much won, so I wasn't going to take a prisoner. I just decided to obliterate the final tank. And now we are invading Sonis proper with the ISS Trojan, our second Neptune-class carrier, with its two Elara Mark II fighters. They served us pretty damn well last turn, so I was pretty confident they'd be able to deal with whatever air defences that Sonis has. Now, I told you I was going to talk about Sonis. Now, Sonis is a Kerbin-like world, but it has unusually high gravity of 1.3 Gs. And that's because Sonis was colonized by our own people. Yes, we're actually fighting a battle here with our own people. Why would you be doing that? Why? Surely they would want to join the Imperium. Well, no. You see, Draidos was always the target for colonization, but our path from Kerbin was going to take us very near to Sonis, and we already disregarded it due to the high gravity. Draidos was a much more promising target for colonization. However, on the way, the life support systems on the ship carrying nearly all of the terraforming supplies failed. And the crew on board, they could have chosen to sacrifice themselves, set the autopilot, and continue to Draidos, saving the hundreds of thousands who had already emigrated to the planet and were waiting desperately for those terraforming supplies. They elected to save themselves and make a landing on Sonis. And as you see, they've turned it into a paradise at the expense of Draidos. Thousands and thousands of our people died because of their inability to think for their people instead of themselves. And as such, we are destroying them with absolute prejudice. That was the plan, until suddenly we see that the air defences consist of an upgraded version of the Firestorm. And now I designed the Elara Mark II to just about be on parity with the Firestorm, that terrifying fighter that we engaged over Gaia, and we just about managed to defeat them due to a combination of pretty funky tactics and a hell of a lot of luck. This is a liberator. Clearly they've been exchanging technology with the Gaian Confederacy at some point. They must have sent scouts out into the system. Well, they did have, as I said, a lot of ships, and they're quite a powerful military, so it wouldn't surprise me if they took the technology from the Gaian Confederacy and improved upon it, because these X-1000 Liberators, yeah, they are just running circles around us. I was so proud of the Elara Mark II. I put hours and hours into these things, but the Liberators just immediately get on our tails and start firing upon us, immediately pretty much blowing one of our wingmen out of the sky. As you see, getting pretty much consistent fire on, and then they rip a wing off of our wingman and he tumbles down towards the ground, utterly helpless. However, our Alara Mark II, the leading aircraft, does manage to swing around, too late to save the wingman, but manages to get onto the tail of one of the Liberators. Now, this thing will not let us chase it at all, and as I said, with antimatter powered aircraft, you get on the tail of something, since they're both so maneuverable, it's very, very hard to shake. So while the wingman of the Liberator attempts to fire missiles at us and chase us off of his tail, we begin chasing this Liberator up and up and up into the atmosphere, higher and higher. I had a little time jump because we were just chasing it for so long. And as you can see, the Liberator's trying every single trick in the book to get us off of its tail, going so high into the atmosphere that our engines literally run out of air to operate. Thankfully though, these thermal ramjets can operate on multiple types of propellants, so what we have to do once we basically can't orient the aircraft anymore is engage our RCS and then switch the engines onto liquid fuel burning mode. However, the problem with this is that we have a finite amount of liquid fuel. Using the intake atmosphere means you pretty much have infinite fuel in the atmosphere. But the Liberator at this point, I don't think the AI can change the engine type, so it's completely run out of energy and it's started plummeting back towards the surface. It has succeeded in getting us off of its tail temporarily, but I have to disengage the AI pilot because I don't think it's used to engaging at 40 kilometers up in the atmosphere. We're on the edge of space at this point, and I begin lining up shots manually to try and blow this thing out of the sky. Its wingman is way down in the atmosphere still, pretty much on the edge of our load range, so it's not much of a threat at this moment in time. However, we begin plummeting towards the planet much faster than I'm used to because of course we're flying in 1.3 Gs and the aircraft is clearly more used to the higher gravity than we are and immediately get back on our tail. Now the AI pilot struggles to deal with this, so I decide to take matters into my own hands. It's flying down on top of us and we're failing to evade it, but we're flying at a pretty insane speed. So what I decide to do is disengage AI pilot and then pull a really hard braking maneuver, causing the Liberator to fly past us at almost twice the speed of sound, allowing us to quickly try and get back on its tail. Unfortunately, as soon as we get down near the surface again, its wingman re-engages us and rips our Alara to pieces. We had a dogfight that took us all the way up to the edge of space, but we still could not best this damn aircraft. Oh, I was so certain that the Alara Mark II would be able to defeat almost anything it met in the sky, but it turns out Tape decided to put literally the best fighter aircraft he's ever put on Fighter Jet Showdown on a planet. So I don't think it's really my fault that our fighters couldn't quite deal with it. But anyway, on the other side of the solar system, we are of course joining the ISS Anubis, the stealth ship that we deployed last episode. And I think I'm going to take this time to explain a little bit how stealth ships work in this series, because I had a huge amount of comments saying, Beardy, you're an idiot, stealth doesn't work in space, blah 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 blah, before I'd even explained how it works. Now, the stealth ships work essentially by making themselves invisible to radar and reducing the amount of infrared they release as much as possible. The ship is not stealth while firing its engine or firing weapons. It has to sit still in a system for a whole turn before it can make itself invisible and use heat sinks in order to limit the amount of infrared it reduces, so it's only very slightly warmer than space. And of course the radar absorbing and deflecting materials it's made of mean that it's invisible to radar, and then it uses photoreflective panels, so it's invisible almost to LiDAR and visible light as well, which is why it appears invisible from a long distance. However, we've arrived in the Moho system here to do a little bit of scouting, and of course we arrive firing our Kerbstein drive, so everything within the gravity well can see our location. However, there is a small ship in a high orbit of the planet. Its transponder identifies it as a Beluga-class corvette. So naturally, we started jamming the Beluga the moment we entered the system, but if we stay here and let it live, it will know our exact location and probably be able to break our jamming signal and relay it to whatever reinforcements it may have lying elsewhere in the system. So we have pretty much no choice than to destroy this ship. So we fire one of our 1.25 meter torpedoes towards it, pretty confident we'll be able to take it out, but they have some pretty advanced targeting systems because they pretty much immediately obliterate it with 30mm cannons, which is particularly worrying. And then they fire two 0.625 meter torpedoes of their own. Thankfully though, the Anubis has got 3-point defense lasers, and as I said, 1-point defense laser can usually reliably stop a single 0.625 meter torpedo. So 2 torpedoes shouldn't be much of a problem whatsoever. Now it starts off looking a little bit worrying, but of course the laser follows an inverse square law, so as soon as the torpedoes get within 1 kilometer, the laser cuts through them immediately, almost at the last minute. We cut it a little fine, but the Anubis is undamaged. And since this Beluga class corvette is being a little irritating to take out, we're going to use the same tactic from earlier and launch 2 separate torpedoes to overwhelm its defenses. And this time it suffers much worse. Although it does actually manage to hit our first torpedo, the warhead itself is still intact and flies in and destroys the engine block of the Beluga, sending it spinning, so it's incapable of aiming its weapons. So although we do miss with the second torpedo, we turn it around since we have plenty of fuel to spare, we fly back and we slam back into the Beluga, completely obliterating it. Now although we jammed the Beluga and our presence should now be pretty much unknown to anything else in the system, I'm sure that whatever friends they have will have noticed the Beluga going silent, and forces on the planet of Moho may well have seen the explosion in orbit. So I'm sure, although that the Anubis is now stealthed, they will send some forces to investigate next turn. So we are of course preparing for potential hostilities with the United Federation of Nebos, constructing 2 defense platforms, one over Scorch, which is of course our gateway to the inner solar system, and one back over Minmus in the Gaia system. I'm not going to lose that system after we fought so hard to wrestle it from the Gaian Confederacy. But there we go. Thank you for watching, everyone. I do hope you've enjoyed. Next episode we will be finishing off the forces on Sonis. There are 3 bases for us to take out. I'm sure we'll think of some kind of way of dealing with those exceptionally capable fighters on the surface, and then we'll probably be building up our fleet for a little bit, and then we'll head out to the outer solar system, the realm of Olum, the brown dwarf, and Jewel, the gas giant. But those will be pretty extensive campaigns. As I said, we need to build up our forces before we do that. So that will all be in a future episode. Thank you for watching, everyone. I've been the Beardy Penguin, and I will see you all next time.